My name is Alexa. I'm 28 years old, and this ugly, lopsided, technically flawed little piece of clay, this thing that was supposed to be the symbol of my greatest failure, it made me a millionaire. And then it made me a millionaire a few more times over for good measure.
They say behind every family secret lies a darker truth. Well, in my story, the secret wasn't some lurid affair or a hidden inheritance. The secret was much quieter, much more insidious. The secret was that everyone was wrong. And the darker truth, it's that sometimes the people who are supposed to be your biggest champions, your teachers, your family, are the very ones holding you down. Not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but out of something far more dangerous, their own fear. So how did this, she holds up the mug again, turning it in the light, this messy little hobby go from being academically worthless to the cornerstone of a multi-million-dollar empire? How did the deafening chorus of voices telling me I'd never succeed fade into nothing more than background noise? And what is the one single piece of paper, a brutal, soul-crushing rejection letter that I have framed on my wall like a diploma? The very document that changed absolutely everything? I'm gonna tell you the whole story. The nitty-gritty, the tears, the dust, the moments I almost gave up. And I promise you, this isn't just a business story. This is a story about the moment you look your biggest, ugliest, most glaring perceived flaw right in the eye and realize it's not a flaw, it's a superpower. Every story has an origin point, a big bang moment. Mine didn't happen in a sterile laboratory or a bustling boardroom. It happened in the damp, earthy-smelling art room of my middle school. I was 12, awkward, braces, perpetually convinced I was the weirdest person in any given room. And then Mrs. Davison wheeled out the pottery wheel. I still remember the feeling, the slight hum of the motor, the hypnotic spin of the wheelhead, and the clay. Oh, the clay. She dropped a cold, wet, gray lump into my hands. It was dense, heavy, formless. It was just potential. She showed us the basics, how to slam it down to get the air bubbles out, how to center it on the wheel. My first 10 attempts were a disaster, a comedy of errors. Clay flew everywhere, on my face, in my hair, on the kid next to me. My lumps would wobble, collapse, and turn into sad, muddy puddles. The other kids laughed. I should have been embarrassed. I should have quit. But I wasn't embarrassed. I was obsessed. Because on the 11th try, something clicked. My hands, which were usually so clumsy, suddenly knew what to do. I felt the clay respond to the pressure of my fingers. I watched as this shapeless mound rose up, thinning into a wall, forming a cylinder. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even a proper mug. It was a wobbly, lopsided cup, but it was a cup that I had made. I had taken a piece of the earth, a literal piece of mud, and given it form and purpose. That feeling, it was intoxicating. It was a sense of control and creation I had never felt before. In a world that felt chaotic and out of my hands, here was something I could shape, something that would listen. The rest of the world, with its math tests and social hierarchies, just faded away. There was only the wheel, the clay, and me. From that day on, that art room was my sanctuary. I spent every lunch break, every after-school moment I could with my hands covered in slip. Mrs. Davison, a saint with a patient smile, just let me be. She saw the spark. She never once told me my work was good or bad. She would just ask, how did that feel to make? I made terrible, wonderful things. Tiny bowls that were too small to hold anything, vases that were so crooked they looked like they were dancing, and mugs. I loved making mugs. There was something so intimate about them. You hold them in your hands. You bring them to your lips. It's a personal connection. My mugs were always me, a little clumsy, a little off-kilter, but warm and full of heart. My parents thought it was sweet. They said, look what our little artist made. They'd display my latest creation on the kitchen counter for a week before it would mysteriously migrate to a dusty box in the garage. To them, it was a phase, a childhood fancy. They were proud in the way you're proud of a finger painting. Cute, but not serious. But to me, it was everything. It was the only thing I had ever done that felt like breathing. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't just learning to throw pots. I was learning to listen to myself. And that skill,
that quiet intuition, was about to be put to the test in the most brutal way imaginable, because I was about to leave the safety of Mrs. Davison's art room and walk into the lion's den. I was going to go to college, and I was going to be an art major. Literal piece of mud, and given it form and purpose. That feeling, it was intoxicating. It was a sense of control and creation I had never felt before. In a world that felt chaotic and out of my hands, here was something I could shape, something that would listen. The rest of the world, with its math tests and social hierarchies, just faded away. There was only the wheel, the clay, and me. From that day on, that art room was my sanctuary. I spent every lunch break, every after-school moment I could with my hands covered in slip. Mrs. Davison, a saint with a patient smile, just let me be. She saw the spark. She never once told me my work was good or bad. She would just ask, how did that feel to make? I made terrible, wonderful things. Tiny bowls that were too small to hold anything, vases that were so crooked they looked like they were dancing, and mugs. I loved making mugs. There was something so intimate about them. You hold them in your hands. You bring them to your lips. It's a personal connection. My mugs were always me, a little clumsy, a little off-kilter, but warm and full of heart. My parents thought it was sweet. They said, look what our little artist made. They'd display my latest creation on the kitchen counter for a week before it would mysteriously migrate to a dusty box in the garage. To them, it was a phase. A childhood fancy. They were proud in the way you're proud of a finger painting. Cute, but not serious. But to me, it was everything. It was the only thing I had ever done that felt like breathing. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't just learning to throw pots. I was learning to listen to myself. And that skill, that quiet intuition, was about to be put to the test in the most brutal way imaginable, because I was about to leave the safety of Mrs. Davison's art room and walk into the lion's den. I was going to go to college, and I was going to be an art major.
The brochure for the Blackwood University of Fine Arts was a masterpiece of marketing. It showed students with paint-splattered overalls laughing in sun-drenched studios. It spoke of nurturing creative voices and forging the next generation of artistic visionaries. It looked like heaven. It felt like my destiny. The reality, as it so often is, was a little different. Blackwood was less about nurturing and more about dissecting. It was a place where art wasn't felt, it was intellectualized. It was a place of theories, of deconstruction, of impenetrable artist statements. It was a place where passion was seen as a bit unsophisticated. And at the very top of this ivory tower, ruling the ceramics department with an iron fist and a tweed jacket, was Professor Julian Albright. Albright was a legend at the university, and not in a good way. He was a critic's artist. His own work consisted of things like a single, perfectly white, geometrically precise cube placed in the center of an empty room. It was stark, conceptual, and completely soulless. And he expected nothing less from his students. He believed that the purpose of art was to ask a question, not to provide comfort. He saw beauty as a bourgeois trap and function as a dirty word. And my first semester with him was a slow-motion car crash. Every piece I brought in, he would dismantle with surgical precision. My rustic, earth-toned bowls, aesthetically lazy. An unsophisticated retreat into primitive nostalgia. My hand-built vases with their organic shapes. An undisciplined surrender to the whims of the material. Where is your intellectual control, Alexa? He never raised his voice. It was always this calm, disappointed tone that was 1,000 times worse than shouting. It made you feel like you hadn't just failed an assignment, you had failed the very concept of art itself. The final critique of the semester is a day that is burned into my memory like a brand. It's the day of the lopsided mug. Our final project was to create a series that explores a cohesive concept. I decided to make a set of 6 coffee mugs. My concept was wabi-sabi, the Japanese worldview centered on the acceptance of transience and imperfection, the beauty of things imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. Each of my mugs was intentionally unique. One was a little wider, one a little taller,
One had a handle that was slightly crooked. They were a family, not a factory line. I was genuinely proud. I thought for the first time I had a concept that even Albright couldn't dismiss. I had an intellectual framework for my heartfelt, messy work. I was wrong. So wrong. The class gathers. The air is thick with the tension and sleep-deprived anxiety that only art school finals can produce. My 6 mugs are sitting on the stark white pedestal in the center of the room. Albright circles them. He's like a predator sizing up its prey. He doesn't touch them for a full minute, just stares. The silence is deafening. Finally, he picks one up, the one with the thumbprint. He holds it between his thumb and forefinger as if it's a piece of contaminated evidence. He squints through his little round glasses. "Alexa," he says, his voice cutting through the silence. "Explain the concept." I take a deep breath. "Well, Professor, it's an exploration of wabi-sabi. It's about challenging the Western obsession with machine-like perfection and finding the beauty and humanity in the imperfect, the handmade." He lets out a small, dry chuckle. It's not a sound of amusement. It's a sound of dismissal. "Ah, yes, wabi-sabi," he says, drawing the word out. A very convenient, very popular excuse among first-year students for a fundamental lack of technical skill. It's the artistic equivalent of saying, "I meant to do that." A few students snicker nervously. My face floods with heat. I feel my hands start to tremble. He continues, turning to the class now, using my work as a lecture. "Look closely," he commands. "The walls are uneven. The weight is unbalanced. This handle," he says, gesturing to it with contempt, "is structurally and aesthetically clumsy. This isn't a celebration of imperfection. This is a failure of discipline." And then he delivers the killing blow. "Furthermore," he says, placing the mug back down with a definitive click, "you have committed the cardinal sin of the serious artist. You have confused art with craft. Art challenges the intellect. It exists to be contemplated. Craft is for use." He says the word use like it's a profanity. "And this, my dear, is not even good craft. From a commercial standpoint, it's entirely unviable. Who would pay for this? It's lumpy. The proportions are emotional." He paused. "There is no future in this kind of work. C-." And that was it. He moved on to the next student. But I didn't hear another word. His voice was just a drone in the background. All I could hear was the echo of his words. Lack of skill, failure of discipline, commercially unviable, no future. It wasn't just a bad grade. It was a professional death sentence, delivered in front of my peers. I gathered my 6 failures off the pedestal, my hands shaking so badly I was afraid I'd drop them. I walked out of that room with my C-, my cheeks burning with shame, and a heavy, sinking feeling in my gut that he was right. I felt like a fraud, an imposter who had somehow wandered into a world where she didn't belong. I didn't know it yet, but that feeling, that deep-seated doubt planted by the cold intellectual criticism of one man, was about to be watered and nurtured by the warm, loving concern of my own family. And that, I would soon learn, was infinitely more painful.
There's a special kind of pain that comes not from an enemy, but from someone who loves you. An enemy's attack is simple. You can fight back, you can dismiss it, but when the criticism comes wrapped in the velvet glove of, "I'm just worried about you," it's 1,000 times more confusing and 1,000,000 times more hurtful. I came home from college for the summer, with my tail between my legs and my spirit feeling like a piece of shattered pottery hastily glued back together. The C- from Albright had torpedoed my GPA, but worse, it had poisoned my passion. Every time I looked at my pottery wheel, which I'd set up in the corner of our dusty garage, I could hear his voice. Commercially unviable, failure of discipline. But a small, stubborn part of me refused to die. A tiny flicker of the 12-year-old girl who fell in love with mud was still there, and she had a plan. A naive, half-baked, but fiercely hopeful plan. I was going to start my own business. I would be the imperfect potter. I'd spend the summer creating an inventory. I'd hit up all the local farmers markets and craft fairs. I'd open an Etsy shop. I was going to prove Professor Albright wrong.
I was going to prove to myself that my work had value. I decided to announce this grand vision at Sunday dinner. This was, in hindsight, a major tactical error. Sunday dinners at my house were a sacred ritual. My dad, David, an accountant who sees the world in debits and credits, would be at the head of the table. My mom, Sarah, a worrier by trade and a kindergarten teacher by profession, would be fluttering around, making sure everyone had enough to eat. And my Aunt Carol, my mom's sister, would be there ready to dispense unsolicited advice and thinly veiled judgments. I waited for a lull in the conversation. My heart was pounding. This felt like a bigger announcement than an engagement. "So," I said, clearing my throat, "I've decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to start a pottery business." Silence. The kind of profound, immediate silence that makes the clinking of a fork sound like a gunshot. My dad was the first to speak. He carefully placed his fork and knife on his plate, creating a perfect 90-degree angle. It was his "I'm about to get serious" pose. "Alexa, honey," he began, his voice laced with a gentle paternal concern that always preceded a lecture. "That's interesting. A business. Have you written a business plan?" Not exactly, but," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "a business is a serious undertaking. It requires a clear understanding of your overhead, your cost of goods sold, your projected revenue stream. What are your profit margins on, say, one of these mugs?" I felt myself shrinking. "Well, a bag of clay is pretty cheap, and I already have the wheels, so—" Aunt Carol sees the opening. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, a gesture of pure, performative concern. "But is that a career, darling? It just seems so uncertain. It's a messy hobby. What about a stable job? Something with a 401k, with benefits. You know, your cousin Mark just got an incredible entry-level position in marketing at a pharmaceutical company. He gets dental," she added, as if that was the pinnacle of human achievement. My mom jumped in, her role as the peacemaker. "Now, Carol, let's hear her out, honey. We just want to make sure you've thought this through. You need something to fall back on. You're so smart. You could get a paralegal certificate online in just a few months. That's a real profession." It wasn't a discussion. It was a coordinated attack disguised as a loving intervention. They weren't listening to my dream. They were projecting all of their own fears onto it. The fear of instability, the fear of the unknown, the fear of being different. They had a blueprint for a successful life, and it involved a steady paycheck, a sensible commute, and a comprehensive dental plan. My dream of selling lumpy mugs at a farmer's market was a terrifying deviation from that blueprint. My dad delivered the final crushing blow, the one that echoed Albright's sentiment, but was so much worse because it came from him. He reached across the table and patted my hand. "Lexi," he said, using my childhood nickname, which felt like a low blow, "we are so proud of your creativity. We are. But we just don't want to see you fail." And there it was. That was the core of it. I looked around the table at these people who I loved, who I knew loved me, and I realized they had already decided my fate. In their minds, I had already failed. My pottery wasn't a potential business. It was a symptom of my failure to launch, my failure to choose a real path. I sat there, pushing my mashed potatoes around my plate, the fight draining out of me. The loud, critical voice of my professor had been the first wave. This, the gentle, loving concern of my family, was the second wave, and it was pulling me under. They thought they were building a safety net for me. But it felt like a cage, a well-meaning, lovingly constructed cage designed to protect me from a life they couldn't possibly understand. And the scariest part, after the humiliation of that final critique, a part of me was starting to think they were right. Maybe a paralegal certificate wasn't such a bad idea after all. Defiance is a funny thing. Sometimes it's a roaring fire, a loud declaration of war. But sometimes it's a quiet, stubborn ember that you protect with cupped hands in the middle of a storm. After that Sunday dinner, my defiance was a tiny flickering ember. I was hurt. I was filled with a paralyzing doubt that felt like a cold sludge in my veins. But I was also angry. The anger wasn't at them, not really. It was at the box they were trying to put me in. The safe, sensible, soul-crushingly beige box of a real job. Their love felt conditional, tied to my willingness to conform. And so I made a decision. I was going to fight back, but I was going to do it on their terms. I was going to speak their language, the language of business plans, profit margins, and 5-year projections. I had to get out of the garage. It had once been my sanctuary, but now it felt like a fishbowl. I could feel my parents' worried glances every time I was out there, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. Is she still just playing with mud? When will she grow out of this? So I did what any desperate, aspiring, but failing artist does. I took the few $1,000s I had saved from years of birthday cards and summer jobs, and I rented the cheapest, saddest studio apartment I could find. It was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up that always smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and regret. It was a miserable little box, but it was my miserable little box. I bought a used kiln that was probably older than I was and set up my wheel in the corner. This was it. This was my professional studio. And in the studio, I wasn't going to be an artist. I was going to be an entrepreneur. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was at the wheel, my hands and clothes caked in drying clay, trying to create a small, cohesive collection. But by night, I was at a rickety card table, hunched over my laptop, diving into the terrifying world of Excel spreadsheets and market research. I, the girl who almost failed economics in high school, was learning about SWOT analysis and customer acquisition costs. I spent hours on the phone pretending to be a confident businesswoman, getting quotes for bulk clay, for shipping boxes, for bubble wrap. I built a financial model that felt like a complete work of fiction, projecting a fantasy where people would actually buy my lumpy mugs. I took pictures of my best failures, arranging them against a white sheet I'd tacked to the wall, trying to make them look like something you'd see in a glossy magazine. I compiled all of this into a thick, intimidatingly official-looking binder. This wasn't just a dream anymore. This was a proposal. This was my armor. And then I made the appointment, a small business loan consultation at the downtown branch of a major national bank. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of the cracked mirror in my bathroom and tried to transform myself. I put on the only business outfit I owned, a slightly too tight polyester blazer and a pair of black slacks from a high school graduation. I pulled my messy, clay-dusted hair into a severe bun. I looked like a child playing dress-up. I felt like a spy infiltrating enemy territory. I walked into the bank, my binder clutched to my chest like a shield. The air was cold and smelled of money and antiseptic. I was led to a small, glass-walled office. And there, sitting behind a large mahogany desk, was him. The final boss, Mr. Henderson. He was a man who was so perfectly groomed he looked like he had been assembled, not born. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly coiffed, his mustache was trimmed with geometric precision, and he was wearing a navy blue tie dotted with little shimmering dollar signs. I'm not even kidding. It was the most soulless piece of clothing I had ever seen. "Miss Morales," he said without smiling. "Please have a seat. You believe you have a business proposition for us?" My voice came out as a squeak. I slid the binder across his polished expanse of a desk. For the next 15 minutes, he flipped through it. The only sound was the rustle of paper. He didn't ask any questions. His expression was a complete blank. It was like watching a robot scan a document for keywords. He paused on the photos of my pottery. He picked up his glasses, polished them, and put them back on to look closer. A tiny hopeful part of me thought, he sees it. He sees the potential. Then he leaned back in his leather chair, a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room, and he chuckled. It wasn't a mean laugh. It wasn't a belly laugh. It was a short, sharp puff of air out of his nose, a chuckle of pure, unadulterated condescension. The kind of laugh that says, "Oh, you sweet, naive, utterly clueless child." He folded his hands on top of my business plan, my 3 weeks of blood, sweat, and tears. "Ma'am," he began, and the word ma'am, from a man like him, feels like a pat on the head. "I commend your thoroughness. It's a very detailed presentation." He paused, letting the faint praise hang in there before snatching it away. "However, the market for artisanal goods, as you call them, is notoriously fickle and heavily saturated. The modern consumer, you see, values consistency. They value brand recognition. They value a certain standard of perfection. What you have here," he said, tapping my binder, "is a lovely hobby, a passion project. It is not, by any reasonable metric, a viable commercial investment." There it was again, that word, hobby. He slid the binder back across the desk to me. The meeting was over. The walk out of the bank is a blur. The sounds of the city, the traffic, the people, all of it seemed distant and muffled, like I was underwater. I felt invisible. I had walked in there wearing a costume, pretending to be a businesswoman, and he had seen right through it. He hadn't just rejected my business plan. He had rejected me. He had looked at the very core of who I was, the thing I loved most in the world, and with a polite smile and a $sign tie, he had declared it worthless. I got back to my cold, cabbage-smelling apartment, dropped my binder of failed dreams on the floor, and just stared at the brick wall outside my window. The ember of defiance was gone. All I felt was the cold, wet ash of defeat. The voices of Albright, of my family, of Mr. Henderson. They were all swirling in my head, harmonizing into a single crushing chorus. Failure, failure, failure. There's a unique kind of cruelty to formal rejection. A verbal no can be argued with, misinterpreted, or softened by tone. But a letter is final. It's black and white. It's a tombstone for your hopes, delivered right to your door. A week after my meeting with Mr. Henderson, it arrived. It came in a crisp, windowed envelope, bearing the bank's regal-looking logo. The paper was thick, expensive. It felt important. It felt like it contained a verdict from on high. I sat on the dusty floor of my studio apartment, my legs pulled to my chest, and I read it. The words swam in front of my eyes, a soup of corporate jargon, designed to be impenetrable. "After a thorough review of your proposal, insufficient collateral and lack of a proven financial track record, the high risk and volatile nature of the proposed sector, we regret to inform you that we are unable to extend a line of credit at this time." I read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, and then something inside me just broke. It wasn't a dramatic shatter. It was a quiet, deep, structural crack, a wave of despair so profound it felt physical, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Have you ever felt that? I mean, truly. Have you ever been in a place where it feels like every single door you have tried to open has been slammed shut, locked, and barricaded? Where the universe has stopped whispering that you're not good enough and has started screaming it through a megaphone? Where you feel so completely and utterly alone with your failure that it feels like its own living, breathing entity in the room with you? Let me know in the comments. Seriously, because I need you to know that if you have ever been in that exact spot, you are not alone. I was there. I was on that floor. I looked around my tiny, miserable apartment. Boxes of my lumpy, crooked mugs were stacked against the wall, and they looked like a pathetic, silent army of my own inadequacy. My secondhand kiln sat cold and dormant in the corner, and in my hand I held this letter, the official certificate of my failure, signed and delivered by the world of responsible adults. Albright was right. My family was right. Mr. Henderson was right. It was over. And I just started to cry. It wasn't pretty. It was this
ugly, ragged, silent crying, where your whole body shakes and you can't catch your breath. I cried for the 12-year-old girl who had found magic in the mud. I cried for the art student who had her heart broken in front of her peers. I cried for the daughter who had disappointed her parents. I cried because I had tried so hard to play by their rules, to fit into their world, and I had still been rejected. I cried until I had nothing left. I must have sat there for hours. The sun went down and the dim city light filtered through my grimy window, casting long shadows across the room. I was empty, hollowed out. And then, in that absolute emptiness, a strange new feeling began to bloom. It was a sense of calm, a bizarre, almost giddy sense of peace. I picked up the rejection letter again, but this time I didn't see it as a verdict. I started to laugh. It was a watery, shaky laugh at first, then it grew stronger. It was the most liberating feeling in the world because I looked at the letter and I looked at my army of imperfect mugs and I had this crystal clear thought, a thought that would change the entire trajectory of my life. Well, if I am already a complete and total failure, then I have absolutely nothing to lose. Think about that. The pressure was gone. The need to please my professors, to satisfy my parents, to impress a man in a dollar-sign tie, it all just evaporated. If I was never going to be commercially viable, then I didn't have to be commercially viable. If my work was a hobby, then I could do my hobby exactly the way I wanted to. I didn't have to make my mugs more perfect. I didn't have to write another business plan. I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I could just be me. And I could make my weird, lumpy, emotional, perfectly imperfect pottery with all the heart and soul I wanted to. That rejection letter wasn't a tombstone. It was a permission slip. It wasn't a cage door slamming shut. It was the key to unlocking it. It was freedom. That night, something inside me was rewired. I stood up, wiped my face, and walked over to my pottery wheel. I took a deep breath, the first real deep breath I'd taken in months, and I made a decision. I was done trying to sell. I was done trying to prove my worth. I was just going to share my story. All of it. The ugly, messy, failed parts. I was going to show them my beautiful failures. I grabbed my phone, opened Instagram, and I prepared to post the picture and the caption that would completely, by accident, launch an empire. If you like this story, please share the video with your friends and family. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. How did you feel about the video? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.